What is a very interesting or odd psychological fact? Story one, placebo effect, is the one that is the strangest to me. It's so wild, like a fake thing that causes a real effect. What's even more wild is that the placebo effect works on animals and it works on humans. When you tell them they're getting a placebo and show them it's a placebo, it's so weird. It works backwards too. It's called the nocebo effect. Patients who don't believe a proven treatment will help them progress more slowly in their healing than baseline patients. Absolutely crazy how much our brain and thinking affects the real world. Story 2, the frequency illusion. The frequency illusion is when you start noticing something for the first time, and suddenly it appears that this something suddenly crops up everywhere. In reality, this is not true. A good example is a not currently trending word you heard for the first time. Suddenly you read and hear this word all the time. Story 3, confronting someone with information that is at odds with what their brain has used to stimulate the amygdala in the same way a physical attack does. So, telling some old person that what they think the world is like is essentially wrong can be compared to a slap in the face. This can be small things as well. I tried to explain to my father once that people are making money off of YouTube as content creators, and that idea was so outlandish to him that he got angry and loud. My girlfriend at the time was really confused and scared afterwards. We ran into this while taking care of my grandmother once dementia had set in. She kept asking where various family members. Originally, my mother would remind her that person had been dead X years. My grandmother would get angry she wasn't told prior and would grieve all over again. I was in high school, and after watching it enough times, I would say they were over on whatever street the cemetery they were buried in was on. She'd handle it better if she knew where they were, not why they were there. Was able to get other family members to follow suit. Daily visits became less stressful for everyone involved. Story 4, Alice in Wonderland syndrome. When I was a little girl lying in bed, I would sometimes feel like I was gigantic, like my body was taking up the entire room or microscopically small. Winds up, this is an actual thing that happens to a fairly large amount of people, although normally just a few fleeting instances in their lifetime. Story 5, I have severely deficient autobiographical memory. I don't know of anyone else who has this condition, and there's only about 2 articles I could find about it on Google. It's non-serious and was not caused by childhood trauma that I'm aware of. I had a safe and fairly loving upbringing. It basically means I lack the ability to revisit any long-term memories. I know that certain things have happened, but I can't go back and watch it in my mind because I didn't store the experience. There are a handful of exceptions, which are mostly recent memories. I had my 21st birthday party 2 years ago, and I don't remember anything that happened during it, but I can see the photos. Seeing photos and videos of myself is super weird because it's like watching someone else because I don't remember doing the thing. This also means I have no perception of my past self, and I don't feel connected to the person I was even a year ago. I know my personality is pretty much the same, but I also know I have changed an awful lot in the last few years. And I think some people think I'm trying to be a different person or something. I'm not, I'm just working solely with my present self and growing how I see fit. It's kind of upsetting that I can't relive most of the good things that have happened to me. But it also gives me a sense of peace because I can't relive the bad things either. That said, I have a very strong imagination, and I've fabricated and remade past events in my head to fill in the gaps. Even though I don't use those imaginary scenarios for anything, it's very odd. Story 6. There are actually blood vessels obstructing light from reaching certain areas in your eye, effectively creating a shadow. Your brain filters this out and essentially fills in the gaps, so you don't actually see this spider web-like network of black lines. However, you can visualize by shining a light at a diagonal into your eye, not directly, and gently wiggling it about. This means your brain doesn't have enough time to filter it out, and you see this spider web, like network of blood vessels. Also, a bit more detailed instructions to clarify the actions involved. I find it easier to see this effect in a dark environment, so the contrast of the black shadow against the light is higher. You want to be staring straight ahead and shining the light into your pupil at a 45-degree angle from the side directed at your nose. Phone lights will do great. Then wiggle the light in gentle 1 centimeter movements side to side. Keep this up for about a second at least, and you should see them. Hope this clears it up a bit. Story 7. When asking for something big, lead up to it by asking for something inconsequential at first, so the person is likely to say yes, followed by slightly larger requests. Once a person has said yes, they feel obligated to keep saying yes. Salespeople do this a lot. On the other hand, if you want something small, start by asking for something ridiculous. So by comparison, the small thing seems trivial. Salespeople do this a lot too. Also, people are more inclined to let you do something if you give a reason. The interesting part is that it doesn't really matter what the reason is. Example, asking to cut in front of someone at the checkout. If you ask, "Do you mind if I cut in front of you? I just need to buy these things," will be more effective than just saying, "Do you mind if I cut in front of you?" Even though the reason is irrelevant. Everyone is in line because they need to buy things. Brains are weird. Story 8. Terminal. Lucidity. Terminal lucidity is a term coined by German biologist Michael Nahm that refers to an unexpected return of mental clarity and memory, or suddenly regained consciousness that occurs in the time shortly before death in patients suffering from severe psychiatric or neurological disorders. This condition has been reported by physicians since the 19th century. This one breaks my heart a little bit. Many have noticed loved ones suffering from Alzheimer's return to a normal just before passing. Story 9. Tachypsychia. Essentially, under situations of extreme stress, your mind starts processing information at such a high rate of speed that time seems to slow down in your perception. Victims of car crashes experience. I experienced it during my first firefight in Afghanistan. It was like the entire world was in slow motion. Famously, you saw Tom Hanks' character, Captain Miller in Saving Private Ryan, experience it during the Normandy landing sequence. I've experienced this. When I was in high school, I was driving with some friends of mine during the winter months, and our car slid into a tree. Right before we hit the tree, I distinctly remember time seeming to slow down as we plowed through the tree. It was a small tree. The whole thing took about 3 seconds, but it felt like 30 seconds to me. I remember the moment right before we hit the tree and the moment right after when I was running away. The friend wasn't supposed to be driving people yet because we were only 16. I didn't realize this was an actual thing. Story 10. Fact 1. It's common for victims of violent crimes to forget key details, even if they saw everything, because their brain is focusing more on how to survive than how to identify the perp. It's rare for prosecutors to have a victim who remembers everything about the perp or the place, which makes the trial difficult, because we often assume that victims will remember all the key details. In fact, they're more likely to remember minor details like smells and sounds. Fact 2. If you keep the first and last letter in every word in the same spot, but rearrange the middle letter, your brain can automatically figure out the words. Story 11. Eye doctor here. The average human blink has an interval somewhere between 6 seconds. But when we read, look at a phone or tablet or computer, for extended hours, the blink interval can reduce to once or twice per minute, and it is damaging to the eyes due to the requirement of spreading tears, but also because the glands are not being milked by blinking and therefore forcing backup of materials, and even in severe cases, death of the glands entirely. These glands are responsible for protection and comfort of the eye, and when left to die, your tears simply cannot protect the eye well enough. Story 12. I frequently bring up this amazing thing that our brain can do, called pareidolia. It's the ability to see patterns in something where there are no patterns. Our brain will literally fill in blanks and make up information for two things to connect to one commonality. The reason that it happens is because of how we organize memories. Every piece of information has to be connected to another piece of information in order for us to recall it. But if a piece of information doesn't connect to anything, our brains can make something up in order to bridge the gap. As a consequence, people can see meaning in things that literally have no meaning and connect dots where there are none. Story 13. People are much more likely to comply with a request when the word because makes an appearance. This applies even if the reason given is just an empty statement. For example, imagine you go to a shopping mall and there is someone sitting on a bench in the walkway. There is plenty of other available seating around. You approach them and ask, "Can I sit there?" At this point, only a tiny percentage would agree to get up. Now let's change what you say so that you grip your back and say, "Can I sit there? Because I've suddenly got a terrible shooting pain in my back." Now a majority will actually comply. Here's the shocking part. We introduce a third strategy where you say, "Can I sit there? Because I really need to sit there." Studies show the majority will still comply, even when the reason is just a nothing statement. Story 14. I'm not sure if this belongs here, but I find it fascinating. Humans truly are absolute creatures of habit and familiarity. Many years ago, before the advent of mobile phones being common, most households had landline phones, and the ringtones of the landline telephones were very similar to each other. Then, with the advent of mobile phones in general and smartphones in particular, a whole world of ringtones opened up. We could have literally any noise at all for a ringtone, from Crazy Frogs, remember him, to songs to fart noises to our own child telling us, "Mummy, answer the phone." I had my son repeating that over and over with an increasing sense of urgency. Sometime in the last few years, though, it seems that most of us have one particular sound. And what sound is it? old-fashioned phone, because in our brains, that is what a phone is meant to sound like. This may well be a regional thing. I live in Australia, but whenever I'm out, the ringtone I hear most often that sends nearly everyone in the vicinity grabbing for their phones is that exact tone, including me. Story 15. All our memories have, while not a timestamp, a vague chronological order. Without having a date or time to include in the memory, we still know that something happened an approximate distance in the past, or just a moment ago, or in a particular order. The problem is, very occasionally a memory is missing that chronology, and so we have no idea when it happened. This is the most likely and common reason for deja vu. We see something and it immediately falls into a vague, it happened at some point timeline. Because we only know it happened sometime in the past, we think that it is a separate event from the one that is currently happening. So we think it has happened twice. Story 16. Your brain tricks you into thinking your biggest weaknesses are your biggest strengths, and the other way around. This often leads to an upside down self image, where you literally see opposite character traits in yourself in comparison to reality or how other people see you. For example, people that are pretty sensitive see themselves as cold and rational. Cold and rational people try everything to convince themselves how much of a feeling person they are. Jung's psychology is really interesting. Story 17. Tolerance, value systems, and association. Your brain has a tendency to adjust to certain things. People call this getting used to it or getting comfortable. The reality is desensitization. A good chunk of the time, people will think something is normal just because of frequent experience or association with something they are familiar with. In reality, it's not that common and can be very wrong. It's actually used to lull people into complacency by easing them into scenarios by habit or routine rather than slow progression. Because the brain uses association for memory or reason, people have a tendency to accommodate things they are familiar with. So the familiarity is used to cause later association. This chain can continue, even though the entire chain of synaptic connections can all be false and take forever to untangle and break down. It's what people mean by being caught in someone's web. The neural network of the brain being manipulated in this way is the reason for a lot of disorders and their difficulty in recovery, especially due to bias or the Pygmalion effect. Johari's window is cool too, but I like the dynamic of decision making between acting and thinking too. Story 18. The bystander effect. If you call out for help in a crowded street, it's very likely no one will help you. Usually they think that someone else will help you, or it's a movie or TV show being filmed, or something similar. If you ever have an emergency or are responding to one, always point your finger at someone and ask for their help, or tell them to do something. For example, someone is having a heart attack in the street. You have first aid training and no CPR. You check for pulse and there is none. So you start to do chest compressions. You need to call the ambulance, and if you just say, someone call 911 inches or someone call an ambulance, and there are a lot of people around, it's quite likely you'd get ignored. So you point at someone and tell them to do it. That way you basically guilt them into doing it. Story 19. When you see an image or video of someone sustaining an injury, example breaking an arm, regions of your brain which are related to pain in that area are stimulated. There have been studies which have shown that our brains begin the mental processes for an action before we have consciously decided to do it. It's a part of an ongoing debate in psychology about our free will. Yelling when injured is an involuntary evolutionary response designed to alert others to your state and summon aid. The James Long theory states that we first experience physiological changes and then feel the appropriate emotion. For example, your heart rate increases, your muscles tense, then you begin to feel fear, not the other way around. Finally, Bowlby's evolutionary theory states that our attitudes towards our own self-worth, internal working model, are almost entirely related to the frequency with which we had our needs as an infant and toddler met by our caregivers. Further studies, example Hazan and Shaver-Love quiz, showed that our attachment styles, Ainsworth's attachment theory, during our time as infants and children influence our attitudes towards romantic relationships. Story 20. If you're playing a sport or a game against someone and they're just trouncing you, ask them something like, "Wow, you're really killing me today. What are you doing differently that's making you play so well?" They're probably in the zone, playing so well by muscle memory, or unconsciously doing it. By forcing them to ask that question of themselves, whether they answer you or not, you take them out of the zone. Can't be helped. It forces them to consciously think about what they're doing, trying to answer that question, taking them out of the zone, and their performance will start decaying rapidly. It's a sneaky thing I learned decades ago. I've used it in everything from tennis to poker. Not guaranteed to work 100% of the time. Depends on your opponent. But when it does, it works like a charm. Story 21. I don't know what it is, but when going to bed, I get truly random slideshows in my brain before I go to sleep. Like last night, from what I remember, I saw closed eyes, a train running through a desert, a giant panda about Godzilla size, eating way too small bamboo sticks. The sun erupts a yellow mass with teeth, my dog, but she was blue. A helicopter parked on the ground with rotor blades so long they touched the ground, aliens infiltrating Secret Service, and many more weird, random things. It's literally as if my brain's ability to filter thoughts is removed as I go to bed, and all the random crap I don't register thinking about during the day gets through all in the span of like 3 minutes before I fall asleep. I'm not lucid dreaming. I am fully conscious, awake, and can move and talk to describe the images and respond to questions. I don't know. Weird to me, even though I've always had it happen to me. Story 22. The more money or time or effort on something, the more you will value it, even if it doesn't make sense to do so. This is part of the reason why we hold on to inanimate objects for so long after they lose their original usefulness. It's also how we justify spending so much time slash money slash effort on things that other people would think aren't worth it. So if you bought a dud of a car, you're more likely to stick with it and make excuses rather than cut your losses and resell or get rid of it. Story 23. My dad told me a story of a time he was once walking out of Victoria Station when he was stopped by a man randomly. Despite him not knowing who the man was, he was able to tell my dad very nuanced information about his family, asking about his sister by name and talking about his cat, etc. After about 5 minutes, he said he'd better be off and left, and my dad has never seen him or heard from him again, effectively disappearing around a corner. To this day, he can't tell you what he looked like, what he wore, or what accent he had, but he distinctly remembered talking to that man. Apparently, this is a psychological thing where your brain just makes up random people without your conscious mind knowing about it. But that's based on some light Googling. Story 24. My favorite is Uncanny Valley. I studied psychology when I was a teenager, and I fell in love with this phenomenon. Basically, you're going for a walk. You see someone walking down the street towards you. It's a nice day. The birds are singing. You feel great. They're a meter in front of you. 9 hamburgers for Americans. And suddenly you're crapping bricks because you've noticed that their eyes are completely black. This is called Uncanny Valley. When we encounter something that looks mostly humanoid, but there's something slightly off about them, we trigger a fear response. It's why people get uneasy around dolls or humanoid AI. A lot of horror movies play on this. The ghost has massive black eye. The silhouette coming towards you is walking weird. Humans have evolved to notice and be afraid of entities that aren't quite human. Have a long think about that. Story 25, thought blocking. A person with psychosis or schizophrenia may be talking about a subject and suddenly go silent, sometimes for a few seconds, sometimes longer. When they come back, they will be on a completely different train of thought. What they've done is blocked an intrusive thought. It may have been a hallucination or a disturbing internal dialogue, but what happens is the intrusive thought is blocked and discarded, and along with it, the previous line of thought. This is why you may sometimes see a mentally ill person talk almost rationally about, say, sushi. Then they go silent, and the next moment they are talking about car batteries. They experienced an intrusive thought, blocked it, then tossed out the previous normal thought with it. It's likely that thought blocking is actually a normal response to an intrusive outside thought or dialogue entering your mind, which makes it unlikely that human beings would ever communicate well telepathically. We would tend to block the implanted communication, then blank on our previous train of thought and have to move on to a new one. Story 26. I don't know that it qualifies as psychological, but trauma can be passed down through multiple generations via changes to DNA. This makes a ton of sense when you realize trauma is caused by the perception you are in extreme danger or at risk of losing your life. But you survived. In order to ensure the survival of your progeny, you would want them prepared to respond to the traumas you've survived. Trauma responses are actually strength-based survival tools, though they can be maladaptive in the wrong contexts. Story 27. There was this study where a group of volunteers were asked to do some task, which consisted of them asking questions to each other, or something, and they were given cranberry juice that was said to have alcohol in it. Over time, as they are asking questions and drinking the juice, they slowly become more and more drunk. By the end of the experiment, the volunteers are visibly drunk and are slurring their words and whatnot. As the volunteers leave, the psychologists in charge of the experiment tell them that there was, in fact, no alcohol in the juice. Upon hearing this, all the volunteers are simultaneously cured of their drunken stupor and are completely sober. The experiment was to test the effectiveness of placebos that could be used to cure mental and even physical illnesses. Story 28, Mirroring. I learned this when studying body language at uni. If you think a girl at the bar or wherever is kind of interested in you, but you're not sure, do something like scratch your nose or cross your arms. If she does it back after a few minutes, it means she is paying attention to you. It works to the point that she may not even know she is watching you, but her subconscious is watching you. Very, very dangerous and pretty unethical to be. But from experience, yeah, it works. Also, don't try it with someone who is clearly sad or happy, whatever, without mirroring that same emotion, because it's just not going to slide.